class, and welcome to today's lecture where we will be diving into the intriguing and complex realm of personality disorders. A really fascinating aspect of social deviance and abnormal psychology. And today, I think you'll find that we get right to the heart of a lot of social deviance. Now, in today's lecture, we will be diving in a little bit to the structure of personality disorders and introduce you to the three clusters of these diverse, rigid manifestations of personality. And we will also dive into some very interesting researchers that have given us some real insights into these areas. And I think that you will find that particularly if you work in the area of corrections, that you will be coming back to these researchers time and time and time again. I know I have. And so I really do appreciate their insights. So let's kind of just give you a little bit of an overview of what we'll be taking a look at here. Within the realm of personality disorders, there are those three clusters. The first cluster is of odd and eccentric behaviors. These are really individuals that exhibit peculiar thought patterns. They have social difficulties and often unusual beliefs. And we can kind of see some specific disorders in this area. The first one that we could kind of think of would be paranoid personality disorder. And that's where there's this pervasive distrust or suspicion of others. There's a tendency towards hypervigilance and a reluctance to confide in others. There's also schizoid personality disorder that tends to be detached and show a very limited range of emotions. They prefer typically to be solitary and to do solitary activities and have difficulty forming close relationships. And then there are the schizotypal personality disorders that are characterized by peculiar thoughts and beliefs and behaviors. These are individuals that may be eccentric in their appearance and their speech, and oftentimes will have unusual perceptions. So that's cluster A, the odd and the eccentric. And then there is cluster B, the dramatic and the emotional and those with erratic behaviors. They tend to struggle with impulse control and have difficulty maintaining stable relationships. And here we have one called antisocial personality disorder. That's one that you'll want to be particularly interested in when it comes to social deviance, because here you have a disregard for the rights of others, as well as impulsivity and a lack of remorse. And individuals with antisocial personality disorder may engage in criminal or violent and deceitful behavior. Then there's borderline personality disorder. And that is someone that often experiences very intense and very unstable relationships. They also have an unstable sense of self-image, as well as instability of emotions. And they may engage in self-harming behaviors or have a feeling of abandonment that is quite pervasive. And also underneath this category is histrionic personality disorder. And here you would think in terms of someone that needs attention. They exude excessive emotionality and have a tendency to be easily influenced by others. And they tend to use their appearance in order to draw attention to themselves. And tied in with that, then, is narcissistic personality disorder, where the individual has an inflated sense of self-importance, a lack of empathy, and a constant need for admiration. And here they tend to exploit others in order to achieve their goals. So that's cluster B, the dramatic, the emotional, the erratic. And then there's cluster C, where you would see something like avoidant personality disorder. And here you would see an individual that has a marked sense of social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and really a hypersensitivity to negative evaluation. And so they would avoid social interaction simply due to fear of rejection. Here also you would have dependent personality disorder, someone that exhibits a pervasive and excessive need to take care of, or sometimes leading to submissive or clinging behavior, someone that wants someone else to take control and to take care of them. And so they often will struggle with ever really kind of having a sense of independence. And then there is the obsessive compulsive personality disorder, not to be confused with the obsessive compulsive personality, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a affective disorder. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder is characterized by a preoccupation with orderliness and perfectionism and control. And so individuals with obsessive compulsive personality disorder may be excessively focused on rules and on details. So that's what we're going to be covering today. We'll obviously be focusing in on a few particular ones, as well as some things associated with personality disorder as it relates to social deviance. Now, I want to start off, as always, with a little story of a researcher. And today, this is somebody that laid the groundwork for our exploration of personality disorders. And this influential person is Theodore Malone. He was born in 1928 and really, and as an American psychologist, became really a towering figure in the field of personality theory. And his career really spanned decades. He started off, got his doctorate from Harvard, so that's a great start right there. And then in his work, he began to characterize what goes into personality disorders. And one of the key things that he did is he developed a psychometric tool that bears his name. It's called the Malone Clinical Multi-Axial Inventory and the Malone Personality Disorders Scales. And both of these tools are used for assessing personality disorders. And so his theoretical framework really emphasized the interplay between biology and psychology and culture, and gave us some very clear tools for understanding the subtypes of personality disorders and helping professionals to identify the overarching diagnosis. And so Theodore Malone's legacy really kind of carries on past his death in 2014, where he influenced theories as well as assessment and gave us some really important tools for continuing on our understanding, not only of the nosology of personality, but also of the treatment of personality and personality disorders. Now, maybe I should kind of clarify a little bit about what a personality disorder is. Personality disorders really are things that, in contrast to clinical disorders, if you remember the 5-axis system that we talked about in the DSM-3 and DSM-4, where there's Axis 1, which is clinical disorders, and Axis 2, which is personality disorders. Personality disorders differ from clinical disorders in that they tend to have always kind of been there with the person, or at least from a very early age. Whereas clinical disorders seem to kind of develop, and then you can treat them, and then they can go away. Whereas personality disorders tend to have been there and tend not to go away. Really, with personality disorders, you just kind of have to minimize the symptoms and the impact as much as possible, and that's about all that you can do. You can't really expect the personality disorder to really disappear. So the thing with personality disorders is that they are enduring patterns of inner experience within the person, as well as behavior that tends to be rigid and follow a certain pattern. And that inner experience and that external behavior tend to deviate markedly from the expectations of an individual's culture. And so these patterns can affect cognition and emotion and interpersonal functioning, as well as impulse control. And importantly, these deviations cause significant distress or impairment in personal or social or occupational areas of functioning, either for the individual, but in some cases the individual is perfectly happy, but it makes everybody around them suffer. And that's the other thing you need to kind of be mindful. Sometimes the distress is not within the individual. Sometimes the distress is everybody around the individual just finds them absolutely horrible to be around. So unlike more transient mental health issues, personality disorders are pervasive and they're enduring. Now, as I mentioned, sometimes they manifest in adolescence or early adulthood, but generally they seem to have always been there. And it's really crucial to recognize that individuals with personality disorders may not always perceive their thoughts or behaviors as problematic, and this adds to a layer of complexity in diagnosing and treatment of the disorder. So it's not only difficult to get them into treatment sometimes, but it's difficult for the therapist to treat them because it tends to be a pervasive pattern. So it can be a very difficult thing to work with. And that's kind of part of the reason why they got rid of the DSM multi-axial system, was some professionals felt that it caused an undue stigma among patients with Axis 2 disorders to make them separate from the other disorders, because people would just realize, oh, I don't want to deal with any Axis 2 disorders because they're so difficult, and that caused a little bit of a backlash within the professional field. Anyways, let's go on, and I want to take a little bit of time now and touch on clusters A and C, but I really want to focus most of my time on cluster B, because that's really at the heart of what this course is about with deviance. So let's take a look at cluster A and these distinct patterns and just dive into it a little bit more. So if you recall, paranoid personality disorder are individuals that exhibit a pervasive and really unjustified mistrust of others. They're always questioning the motives of others. And they often interpret very benign actions as being malevolent. So it's as if their self-protection system is dialed up to 11, and that significantly influences their thinking patterns. And they're going to therefore tend to be very reluctant to confide in others, to develop close associations, to have quality friendships. And so they tend to be very isolated, which doesn't help the situation. And this heightened suspicion can really strain relationships, and it can lead to a lot of social isolation for the individual. And so oftentimes you will find that the person themselves believe that they're one of the few people that sees the world for what it truly is, and they wonder why everyone else doesn't agree with them. And then they believe that the rest of the world has the wool pulled over their eyes, and that's why people don't want to be around them, when in truth it is that they are just so suspicious that it causes a great deal of angst for anybody around them. Then there is schizoid personality disorder. And when you think of schizoid, you can kind of think in terms of they want to be separate from others. They want to be detached from others. And in some ways, so schizoid, the term there really kind of points to a splitting away from others. So schizoid personality is marked by a significant detachment from social relationships. And on top of that, there's a limited range of emotional expression. So with that, the person with this kind of disorder is going to tend to prefer solitary activities and almost express and seem to not really care if they have close connections with anyone else. Now, they can go into a social situation, but their emotional detachment really tends to hinder their development of any meaningful relationships. And so it means that they're always kind of apart from the group in a lot of ways. And then there's the schizotypal personality disorder. And this is you can kind of think it kind of like schizophrenia, but not as extreme. It's kind of like they have a tenuous grasp on reality, just enough where everything seems a little odd, but they're still in touch with reality. It's just that it's a very weird kind of sense of reality. And so the schizotypal personality disorder can oftentimes be characterized by very eccentric thoughts, eccentric behaviors, and eccentric appearance. So individuals with this disorder may experience some discomfort in social situations, and sometimes this stems from some paranoid fears that aren't grounded in reality or misinterpretation of reality, and they may display some peculiar thoughts or even magical thinking. And so while I want to be clear, this isn't schizophrenia, because there isn't full-blown psychotic disorders, although it's very close to it. You just kind of need to be mindful that this is kind of a constant, pervasive, enduring way of being for this individual, to be very odd and eccentric. And that is our cluster A. Now, let's take a look at somebody that may, in fact, have, and again, I want you to be mindful that this is the kind of thing where we have to be a little bit careful, because there wasn't any formal diagnosis of Nikola Tesla in this case, but he does seem to fit a lot of the criteria for cluster A, specifically schizotypal personality. And so I want to kind of bring this in, partly to highlight the fact that just because you have a disorder like this doesn't mean that you have nothing to contribute. It may be that you have an immense amount to contribute, but you are still going to have some social problems. In the case of Nikola Tesla, and if you don't know who Nikola Tesla was, he was a kind of a visionary inventor. He was an electrical engineer. He was a electromagnetic theorist and a physicist. He was born in 1856 and died in the mid part of the Second World War in the United States. He was born in Serbia and then immigrated to the United States. And within the field of electrical engineering, he really did transform the world. He had a truly innovative mind, but his life was marked with a lot of eccentricities that really do align with cluster A and specifically schizotypal personality disorder. So just a little bit of a reminder here. I know we just talked about it, but schizotypal personality disorder is characterized by those eccentric thoughts and behaviors and unique mannerisms and ways of interacting with the world. And this can cause some social anxiety and can cause isolation from others, and is typified by some very unconventional beliefs. Now, what we see with Tesla is that he was very well known for his eccentric behaviors and his unconventional beliefs. He had a penchant for secluding himself and spending long periods of time avoiding any close relationship with anybody, and he tended to get caught up in his own peculiar thought patterns. And while this clearly helped him to come up with some of his ideas, he really kind of was isolating himself because of his peculiarity. He had a number of rituals that he tended to engage in. He tended to talk to birds more than he talked to people. And his whole unorthodox lifestyle and unconventional beliefs really helped to set him apart from those that really could have made him a huge success. And so while he had a lot of breakthroughs in science and technology and a lot of our knowledge about many areas come from him or stem from some of his ideas, he struggled financially. He lived in increasing isolation and ended up really kind of penniless because of his inability to socially integrate. And so you see there's some of the challenges that can happen with schizotypal spectrum. And so I just kind of want to highlight that there's somebody that likely suffered from this cluster A personality disorders and yet contributed much, but it still cost him a lot as well. Let's go on to cluster B. And I think that you'll find that this is kind of at the heart of what we are interested in. The first thing to kind of highlight with cluster B is that you have these rigid and pervasive patterns of dramatic and emotional and erratic behavior. And the very first one is one that is particularly of interest when it comes to violent and chronic violent behavior. So the chronic offender is going to fit into this category very, very nicely. And this is antisocial personality disorder. And here you have persistent patterns of disregard for the rights of others. So this can be just power thrusts, where you are just overly intimidating people on a chronic basis, or engaging in deceitful behavior and just chronically lying to people, or criminal behavior where you just simply straight up stealing from people constantly. And there's a lack of empathy. You don't care what happens to the other person. And there's a legitimate not caring. It's like, I want it, I'm going to take it, whatever it is. And so there's this profound impulsivity that ties in with that. And it's also associated with a heightened risk of, obviously, legal troubles and interpersonal conflicts, because it is a pattern that's pervasive, and the normal social pressures that would be in place to manage someone interpersonally or legally simply do not register with this person. And so that is why there is this chronic problem. The entire lack of empathy there is profound. Okay, and so this is the one where you really kind of have to be worried about them harming others. Then we go on to some others where they can harm others, but to some extent it's in a different way, and there's just as much possibility of them harming themselves. Okay, so the next one is borderline personality disorder. And here we have something that's marked with instability in self-image and relationships and mood. And so the individual with borderline personality is going to experience some very intense episodes of anger or depression or anxiety. And this is going to lead to self-harming behaviors, which tend to soothe and calm out because they're focusing attention on, it causes their body to focus attention upon a particular painful action. And that tends to kind of even out all of this instability that's going on within the person, and tends to ease what tends to be a very pervasive pattern of abandonment. So there's emotional volatility, there's volatility in a sense of self and who you are and what you're good at. And these are really key features of borderline personality disorder. And so with borderline personality disorder, and particularly with this self-harming, there's can be a kind of a significant risk of suicide. And while it isn't necessarily a desire to die, the self-harming can get to a point where the actions of self-harm, where the emotional goal is simply to even out the emotions, turns into something that's much more dangerous for the person. So like cutting their arm or something in order to calm their emotions, and they accidentally cut an artery in their wrist and bleed out, that sort of thing. So there is some significant concern there. Then we have histrionic personality disorder, and this is characterized by a constant need for attention, excessive emotionality. So you can kind of think of the very intense actor here. There's a tendency to be easily influenced by others. Okay, so you can think of the actor that wants to be in front of the crowd, but needs a director to kind of keep them going in the right place. So individuals with histrionic personality disorder will sometimes use their appearance and behavior in order to draw attention to themselves. Very dramatic when they come into a room, and you can see that kind of drama exude out of them. And what they're doing there is seeking some assurance, some reassurance, and some approval. And so there's this chronic bit of anxiety underneath, and they're trying to soothe that. But this is a pervasive, rigid pattern in living. So it isn't something where you would just see them doing that on stage and then they're a normal person off stage. No, the person with histrionic personality disorder is kind of going to be like this when they just go into a regular group. They're going to be very expressive and engage and try to draw attention to themselves in many ways. So there's that. And then there's the narcissistic personality disorder. And narcissistic personality disorder, someone that they don't necessarily have the right to be as confident as they are, or to have earned the kind of respect that they expect. And so there's this exaggerated sense of self-importance. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is a lack of empathy. So they're going to really not care about anybody else. They don't really have the ability to perspective take and consider other people. It's how can I use people to serve my self-importance and without any concern of what it does to anybody else. And so there's a constant need for admiration. And so individuals with narcissistic personality disorder are going to exploit people in order to achieve their goals. And it's going to be a chronic and a pervasive thing. And they might do it in a very smooth kind of way, but they're still exploiting people. And so their relationships are often marked by a lack of reciprocity. They demand things of people, but there isn't necessarily a concern on their part of being fair back. Maybe minimum payment and no, reciprocal social support in any way. Because in their mind and in their world, everybody exists to serve them and their ego. So with all of these, I hope you see that there can be some significantly difficult times when you are around something like one of these individuals. Now, maybe I'll touch on one individual within cluster B. And while antisocial personality is one where, criminality, we'll kind of touch on that a little bit more later on. But I want to kind of touch on borderline personality disorder, because here's somebody that, with Amy Winehouse, somebody that was known to have borderline personality disorder, so cluster B. And here's an example of someone who suffered significantly from it, despite all of her talents. Now, Amy Winehouse, if you don't know who this is, and for some of you may be young enough that you don't remember who this individual was or weren't ever exposed to her, she was born in 1983 and she died in 2011. And Amy Winehouse, she was a singer and songwriter from the UK, and was really known for a very soulful voice that really captivated audiences. She was kind of like the Adele before Adele was a thing. And despite her powerful music, her life was really turned upside down on a regular basis. And she clearly struggled with some intense emotional struggles that really do align with classical borderline personality traits. And some of these will include things like, a very intense and unstable relationship. So she was, famous within the tabloids for having relationships where things were either on top of the world or they were down in the dumpster. And there was a lot of instability in her public life, even with relationships. And there was a lot of impulsivity and self-destructive behavior. There was concerns, public concerns, of her substance abuse and her self-harming behaviors, particularly because they were so profoundly impulsive and oftentimes very self-destructive. There was also the typical identity disturbance. So here you have somebody that is world renowned as a musical artist, and yet she struggled with her own self-image and her own identity. And this is something that, if you look at some of her music, it's evident in her lyrics, as well as in her public persona. And so there was a consistent identity disturbance kind of going on within her life. And all of this kind of came to a head when she, in the midst of all this self-destructive behavior, died at the young age of 27, despite being a worldwide success. And I think this just kind of highlights how the internal intensity of emotional experiences, coupled by the struggles in forming stable relationships, can really be destructive. And in the case of borderline personality, it isn't necessarily that the person is wanting to die, but they're doing self-destructive things in order to find some kind of feeling of stability that through self-destructive behaviors. And that is never going to end well. Okay. Then we come to cluster C. And cluster C is that avoidant cluster, where you have that very anxious and fearful behaviors. And so within cluster C, we have avoidant personality disorder, where a person is very hypersensitive to rejection. They have very pervasive fears of criticism. And, everybody has a little bit of fear of criticism and a fear of rejection, but this is to the extreme, so much so that they're willing to avoid social interactions. Because the fear of being negatively evaluated is so profound that it hinders them from doing anything. And so they would rather disconnect from society rather than experience that fear and rejection anymore. And so this really kind of significantly hinders their ability to form relationships going forward. Okay, then there's dependent personality disorder, and this is marked by very excessive need to be taken care of. And really kind of a fear, the extreme clingy person, the need to fear being abandoned by an individual, the difficulty, this person has difficulty making their own decisions and may go out to great lengths to obtain the support and assurance of others. And sometimes that can mean having multiple serial partners, where they're constantly looking for that comfort wherever they can find it, that reassurance, that support. And so there's a tendency to be very submissive and very clingy in their behavior, and that can cause a lot of consternation on the part of the people around them as well. And then finally, there is obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And so remember, this is distinct from obsessive compulsive disorder, which is having intrusive thoughts and then behaviors that relieve those thoughts. In the case of obsessive compulsive personality disorder, there is that enduring and rigid pattern that has always kind of been there for a strong preoccupation with orderliness and perfectionism and of control of their environment. And so they will, and this means, when they go into somebody else's home, they want to control that home as well. And so individuals with obsessive compulsive personality disorder will be excessively focused on rules and on details, and often at the expense of flexibility and of efficiency and of the care of the people around them, where the rules and the details become more important than the people that the rules and the details are there to support. So, that is our cluster C personality disorders that are characterized by significant distress related to their anxious and fearful behaviors. Okay, let's take a look at somebody from history that tends to fit into one of these molds. And in the cluster C here, we can think of someone like Emily Dickinson, that American poet. She lived in the middle to late 1800s, so from around 1830 through to 1886. And here you have somebody that really contributed a lot to American literature. And yet, despite her literary genius, Emily Dickinson's life was marked by a very reclusive and solitary existence that really does align almost perfectly with avoidant personality disorder. In fact, some of her writings will very much look like, the typical thinking patterns that you would have with avoidant personality disorder. She's very well known for her social avoidance, her tendency to limit any social interaction. She would deliberately withdraw from society. She preferred to be solitude at home, and all of this avoidance was driven by a deep-seated fear of negative evaluation. Isn't that interesting, coming from somebody that is so famous? She also had a profound fear of criticism. She was very, in fact, reluctant to publish her poems during her lifetime, and her selective engagement with correspondence really kind of points to a fear of criticism and a desire to protect herself from any kind of potential rejection. And because of this, she limited her relationships significantly. She had an extremely small circle of close relationships. And even within those, she was selective in her interactions. And so her fear of intimacy and potential judgment played a significant role in shaping her social behaviors. And while she's an American literary genius, her avoidance of social engagements really kind of underscores the challenges that someone that might be so gifted and yet suffers from a cluster C disorder can have. There's this tension where she wants to be connected, but the fear of rejection just kind of overwhelms her. And so leaves this kind of huge scar on her life and what her life could have been. Now, I want to take some time and go and touch on cluster B again. Remember, I had mentioned that we would circle back to cluster B, and I want to highlight specifically antisocial personality disorder, because this disorder is of particular significance due to its association with a disproportionate impact on violent crime. Now, remember, antisocial personality disorder is characterized by a pervasive pattern of disregard for others, deceitfulness, impulsivity, irritability, and a lack of remorse for wrongdoing. You look at prisons, particularly those that have a long rap sheet, that's what it is. Generally tends to be. And so individuals with antisocial personality disorder, while we can't say they are all criminals, they may engage in criminal activities and manipulation and a general disregard for social norms. And one of the hallmarks of antisocial personality disorder is a tendency toward aggression and antisocial behaviors, often resulting in an increased likelihood of involvement in violent crime. And research consistently indicates a higher prevalence of individuals with antisocial personality disorder in forensic settings, correction settings, prisons, and among the convicted of violent offenses. And so I hope that kind of makes sense a little bit. Now, I want to kind of shift a little bit from antisocial personality disorder and what is often termed the psychopath. Okay, and so there are different personality characteristics that go into psychopathy rather than just into one of the traditional DSM disorders. So it's important for us to kind of understand that difference. Because we need to distinguish between antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, because oftentimes we use them interchangeably, but they're not quite the same thing. Antisocial personality disorder is a personality diagnosis listed in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So it encompasses a very pervasive pattern of disregard for the rights of others, deceitfulness, impulsivity, irritability, and a lack of remorse. And individuals with antisocial personality disorder may engage in criminal behavior, but can also exhibit non-criminal forms of antisocial conduct. Now, psychopathy, on the other hand, that is a psychopath, is a personality construct that captures a set of personality traits and interpersonal styles. So psychopathy is not a formal diagnosis in the DSM-5. But forensic psychology does have some tools for assessing psychopathy because it is very useful as a predictor for chronically dangerous offenders. And in some countries, there is a dangerous offender category. And oftentimes these psychopathy tools are used to assess whether or not they are. One of those such tools is something known as the Hare Psychopathy Checklist. And we'll take a look at that in just a few minutes. But psychopathy, therefore, really kind of includes traits like superficial charm, grandiosity, lack of empathy, and a manipulative interpersonal style. So while an antisocial personality disorder may be very violent, oftentimes it's obvious and they're kind of unpleasant to be around as individuals, whereas a psychopath is often very pleasant to be around because they have a superficial charm and a grandiosity that tends to draw people in. And because they have a manipulative interpersonal style, they're able to get people to do what they want. And because they lack empathy, they can form huge minions of people to do their will. So they don't necessarily have to do anything. They can just get other people to do what they want, and they can reap the rewards and stay out of trouble with any criminal prosecution. So, whereas antisocial personality disorder is a clinical diagnosis, psychopathy is a broader personality construct that's often assessed through clinical tools. So it kind of has to do with the scope of traits. Antisocial personality disorder encompasses a wide range of antisocial behaviors, including criminal and non-criminal conduct, whereas psychopathy focuses more on personality traits and interpersonal style. Now, there are obviously some similarities. Both antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy are characterized by a lack of empathy and a disregard for the rights of others and the well-being of others. They just don't care. They also tend to show a lack of impulse control. So both conditions often involve impulsive and irresponsible behavior. So it's important to understand the distinction between the two, because they aren't strictly interchangeable terms. Now, I want to highlight here a little bit of a key researcher in the field of psychopathy, a fellow by the name of Robert Hare, who's a leading researcher in the field and someone who has contributed significantly to our understanding of dangerous offenders, psychopathy, and psychopathy in society, and particularly in the corporate world. Now, Robert Hare was born in 1934 in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and is a psychologist and researcher. He's now retired, but he was a professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada for many, many years. And while he's now retired, he is very well known for a lot of groundbreaking research, particularly in identifying the personality aspects that go into a psychopath, then creating a measure to study psychopathy. And so within his tool, known as the psychopathy checklist, and now there's a revised version of that, there are specific traits that you can look for. Some of them are things that you wouldn't necessarily think of, like glibness, like a superficial charm, and then others that you would kind of expect, like a lack of empathy and a history of criminal versatility. So all of this goes together, and you take the tool itself, you take a full history and gather information, not just from the individual, but from social records from other people and so on, so that you get a full picture, because you can't really trust just the information that you're getting from a psychopath. And through his research, he really highlighted that there are some neurological and some genetic factors that are associated with psychopathy. And this really kind of highlights the complex interplay of personality between nature and nurture. And his work has gone a long way to help the criminal justice system and forensic psychology be able to make better decisions about dangerous offenders. And so his work isn't just of academic importance, it's of societal importance, because it really kind of influenced our sense of understanding who are those that are really truly dangerous and have a tendency to not change. There isn't necessarily going to be reform for these individuals. They are going to play their significant roles and harm and use people over and over and over again. Now, as you can see there, there's a cover of one of his books called Snakes in Suits. And this really kind of highlights the thing that a psychopath isn't necessarily somebody that's going to be in prison. Just as often they're going to be a CEO, because what makes a CEO? Someone that has charm, even though it's superficial. Someone that can draw people in and then manipulate people and maximize profits by having a lack of empathy for those that are working for them. So they get people to do what they want, but the people don't get the reward. They get the reward, and so yeah. So that's just a little bit of the work of Robert Hare. Now we'll just kind of dive into his checklist a little bit so you can kind of look at and see that a little bit more. Now, with this checklist, there are a variety. There's almost a couple dozen, not quite, but almost a couple dozen key criteria. And I don't want to go into it too much because there are some protected factors with psychometric tools like this. But basically what you have are rating scales within this as you go through all of the material and you evaluate all the material and rate it based upon different personality factors like glibness and superficial charm. So whereas the antisocial personality disorder person is going to be very rigid and oftentimes easily angered and not be able to kind of be all that smooth. A psychopath will have a tendency to be very smooth and very charming and be able to say all the right words. And what they're doing there, though, is not really caring about you. They are masking their underlying manipulative intentions. And it's only after the fact, after you've been fleeced, that you discover this. Then there's the grandiosity and a sense of self-worth. There's this idea within them that there's a pervasive, that they are worth everything, that they deserve to be at the top. And so there's a pervasive and exaggerated belief in one's own importance and superiority and entitlement. There's also a need for stimulation and a proneness to boredom. So psychopaths will tend to seek out excitement. They're easily bored and often engage in risky or impulsive behaviors. In some forensic treatment programs, we'd call this the big E, the excitement that draws people in. And so there's a thinking pattern towards the big excitement. There's also pathological lying. There's just a pervasive, frequent deception and manipulation. And oftentimes there's a goal behind it. So it's not lying for lying's sake, but there's always a seeking to gain an advantage. The world is seen as I must win, you must lose. There is no such thing as a win-win for a psychopath. If you're doing well, then I must destroy you because only I can do well. There is no balance in the universe except for me to do well and for you to suffer. So often it's for personal gain. It's for achieving your own goals. And so there's some cunning and manipulative parts to this. A psychopath tends to have a talent for influencing others for personal advantage through their charm and deceit and intimidation. There's also a lack of remorse or guilt. It's very striking, actually, how genuine concern or regret for harm is just utterly absent in these individuals. It's just like they don't have the capacity for it. Even when the harm is just a direct result of their own action, they just don't care. And so it doesn't exist. And there's also tends to be shallow affect in that their emotional responses are often very superficial and with really lack of genuine emotional depth. If something happens and if they do cry, they tend to be kind of fake tears or fake cries. There isn't a natural flow of tears like you would get with someone that's genuinely full of grief. It's more like I have to fit in socially, so I will feign a crying face. There's also callousness and a lack of empathy. Again, coming back to this lack of empathy. And so there's this general disregard for the feelings of others. And tied in with that is the exploitation of everyone around them. So there's this parasitic lifestyle where they exploit others, they live off the efforts of others without a sense of needing to reciprocate any of that. And there's also poor behavioral controls. The impulse control is poor. And this leads to behaviors that sometimes can be very socially unacceptable, although they tend to hide that extremely well. And so understanding all of these components really kind of helps us to assess the presence and severity of psychopathic traits in individuals. And the checklist aids in identification of psychopaths across various contexts, including forensic evaluations and research studies. And by the way, one of the fascinating things I see is that psychopathy in political leadership, there are very often times you will see all of these traits coming out. And you need to kind of be mindful that particularly in nations where there is not a lack, where there's not term limits, this can be a real problem where society, it does take time for society to go down a certain path. But if a psychopath is allowed to stay in control of a government for a period of time, significant period of time, you can see the society really start to fall apart because the entire society gets subsumed under this psychopathological need to do for the personal gain and the legacy of one individual. I'll let you kind of think of different people throughout history that might have followed along this line. One easy one would be Stalin. Hitler as well would have been one that would be a great example of a psychopath. Now, another individual, in this individual, Dennis Rader, really highlights how psychopathy is such an insidious thing and how it can kind of play out. Now, so I wanted to just take a little bit of time and dive into the life of Dennis Rader. So he's known by many as the BTK killer, bind, torture, and kill. And so he was a serial killer, and just a stark illustration of the extreme manifestations of psychopathy. Now, I'm not saying that every psychopath is a serial killer, because psychopathy is actually quite common. Between 2 and 5% of the population, you could kind of say fits into that general pattern of personality characteristics. But what you have within someone like Dennis Rader is that combined with a fascination for for specific harm of others. Oftentimes, if the typical psychopath would, if they're going to cause violence to somebody else, they get somebody else to do it. They'll get someone that has an antisocial personality disorder to work for them and to do it rather than to do it themselves. But oftentimes you'll see with serial killers, they hide behind a facade that allows them to continue on with multiple murders over time. And Dennis Rader is a great example of that. He had superficial charm and glibness. So to the outside world, and if you see the picture there, he looks like a school teacher. He looks like a math school teacher. Not anybody that would cause anybody any harm. And he lived maintaining a normal family life while committing very heinous crimes. And he displayed a disturbing level of charm. People liked him. In fact, people liked him so much that he was the chairperson of the local Lutheran church and was actually captured when police traced one of his messages where he was taunting police to the church-owned computer. So just be mindful. That's one of the things that psychopaths will do. They will use something like religion or the respectability of politics or of business to hide behind and then to do what they do. The other thing is he had a grand sense of self-worth, and so he would taunt the law enforcement through different communications, and he would send messages to media, and this just kind of shows his inflated ego and his belief in his own intellectual superiority, that he was so smart that no one would ever be able to catch him. He also had a need for stimulation and a proneness to boredom. He would spend his time developing elaborate plans of excitement for the execution of his crimes, and then he would reflect upon the excitement and the stimulation that he would get from them. He also was a pathological liar. He consistently lied to his victims in order to create a false sense of security so that he could get them in a vulnerable situation where he could then carry out his brutal acts. He was also very cunning and manipulative. He had the ability to elude police and law enforcement for decades, and he would send out these taunting, cryptic messages that really kind of demonstrates his high level of interest in manipulating and his cunningness. And obviously, being a serial killer, he lacked remorse or guilt. He just shocking absence of remorse, even describing his murders in detail during his court trial while displaying any sign of guilt. Something I've noticed is that, when someone is talking with a psychopath and describing how the psychopath has harmed them, their response will be, "I feel fine." Like the only thing that matters is how they feel, not how they've destroyed the lives of others and destroyed the whole society around them. There's also shallow affect. So they can tend to be very calm and have a very detached demeanor. And this can be both during their crimes, but also in discussing the crimes later on. And so this just shows a lack of genuine emotional depth. And there's also a callousness and a lack of empathy. So And this is marked by some extreme cruelty and sadism. And this really showcased a complete lack of empathy for his victims, particularly in Dennis Rader's case, where he's the one that kind of termed himself the BTK, the bind, torture, kill. And so Rader's case really serves as a bit of a chilling reminder of the potential for the extreme violence in individuals with these psychopathic tendencies and traits. As far as world leaders today, I would venture to say that in the news, Vladimir Putin would be a great example. If you just look at his history of patterns of dealing with the people around him, a great example of a psychopath in power. Okay, now we go on, and how do we treat these personality disorders? Well, the first thing you need to kind of be mindful of is that while personality disorders often pose significant challenges, there are some therapeutic approaches that are aimed to alleviate the symptoms and to improve the functioning and enhance the overall well-being. But remember here that the expectation, the prognosis is different for personality disorders than it is for clinical disorders. Clinical disorders, we can kind of expect at times that person can get better. In these cases, this is probably going to be with them for the remainder of their life. And so it's about managing specific symptoms. So in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy, it's identifying and changing thought patterns and behaviors. So in the terms of something like cluster B disorders, it would be identifying, so for example, criminal thinking patterns, identify, and then practicing ways of making decisions that are a little bit different. In terms of borderline personality disorder, there's a particular type of psychotherapeutic approach called dialectic behavioral therapy that is specifically designed for borderline personality disorder and really emphasizes skills to manage emotions and interpersonal effectiveness and the distress tolerance that kind of goes along with that. There's also some medications, and while this is not the primary treatment for personality disorders, if there are specific symptoms such as mood stabilizers or sometimes antipsychotics that can help with some of the bizarre thinking and the kind of paranoid thinking that can go on with cluster A disorders, then we can have that as well. Then there's group therapy, and here you're looking for developing some personal support, developing some interpersonal skills, some psychoeducation. Sometimes hospitalization is required. Oftentimes this is necessary to ensure safety of the individual, stabilization of the individual. In the case of borderline personality, that'd be a great example. Or institutionalization for the safety of others. And that can sometimes be the case where they're going to harm others if they are not institutionalized. Then there is skills training, and here we're trying to teach them some practices for regulating their emotions or for some interpersonal effectiveness, particularly in cases of social isolation, to give them some skills so that they can interact with others when the need arises, so that they can problem solve a social situation a little bit better. And also, things like family therapy can go a long ways to help those that are living around the individual as much as the individual themselves. Because remember, in a lot of these cases with personality disorders, the person that's suffering isn't necessarily just that individual that has the personality disorder, but the people that are in relationship with that personality, whether that be just by virtue of proximity or because they were born into the same family. So all of this goes a long ways to mitigating some of the impact that can happen with specific personality disorders. And ideally will help them to form some positive relationships that can allow them to live a good and peaceful life. Okay, let's just close. We just want to close with getting you to think in terms of, what would be a way of thinking of personality disorders, and just kind of remember that this is something that is a pervasive trait within the individual. It's not something that you can necessarily change, but needs to be dealt with in some way. And do that with love and care, but still recognizing that the person probably is not going to change a whole lot, and that a lot of what they do, they are simply not aware of, like care for others. Oftentimes, there's just not the ability to perspective take. And so decisions need to be made as to how to best handle a situation like that. Hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you guys next week. You take care. Goodbye.